Rancher's daughter escaped a forced marriage, only to be found by a desert stranger. She walked barefoot into the desert to die, free rather than marry the man who bought her like cattle. But when a mysterious gunslinger found her 3 days later, barely alive under a Joshua tree, her father's $1,000 bounty hunters were already closing in, and the choice between love and survival would cost someone everything. The wedding dress hung in Clara's bedroom like a corpse, its ivory silk catching the first pale light of dawn. She had not slept, could not sleep. The dress seemed to watch her with empty sleeves that would never embrace love, only duty. Only gold. Her bare feet touched the cold wooden floor, and she dressed in silence. Not in silk, not in lace. In her oldest riding clothes, worn soft from years of secret escapes to the creek where her mother used to sing. The silver locket around her neck held the only treasure that mattered now, a faded photograph of a woman who had died believing her daughter would choose her own path. The house breathed around her, heavy with her father's plans and the cattle baron's money. Somewhere in the darkness, her wedding contract lay signed and sealed, trading her body for grazing rights and water access. She was 18 years old, and her life had been sold like a prize heifer. Clara moved through the hallway like smoke, past the oil paintings of stern-faced relatives who had built this empire of dust and cattle. Their eyes seemed to follow her, judging her cowardice. But what they could not see was the courage it took to choose the desert over the altar, death over dishonor. The kitchen door whispered open. She took only what she could carry, a jar of water, a handful of jerky, a knife her mother had used to peel apples. Everything else belonged to her father's world, and she wanted none of it. The silver locket bumped against her heart as she stepped into the cool morning air. The barn stood like a cathedral in the gray light. Her horse, Melody, nickered softly at her approach. Clara pressed her face against the mare's neck, breathing in the familiar smell of hay and leather and freedom. But she could not take Melody. The horse would be too easy to track, too obvious a trail for her father's men to follow. "I'm sorry, girl," she whispered, and meant it more than any prayer she had ever spoken in church. The desert stretched beyond the ranch like an ocean of thorns and promise. Clara had walked these edges as a child, but never deeper, never alone. Her mother had warned her about the rattlesnakes and the scorpions, the sun that could cook a person's brain, the silence that could drive the weak mad. But her mother had also told her stories of the Apache women who had lived free in these wastelands, who had chosen hardship over surrender. She walked. The sun climbed slowly, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Behind her, the ranch grew small, then smaller, until it disappeared entirely into the rolling hills. Her bare feet found the rhythm of the desert. Step carefully, watch for thorns, conserve strength. The wedding dress will be discovered soon. The empty bedroom. The missing daughter. By noon, her water was half gone and her lips were already beginning to crack. The sun pressed down on her shoulders like the weight of judgment itself. She had not considered how quickly the desert would claim her, how eagerly it would strip away her softness and reveal what lay beneath. Was she brave, or was she simply foolish? The desert would decide. The mountains rose ahead of her like sleeping giants, blue and distant and impossible. She had no map, no plan beyond walking away from everything she had ever known. Her mother's locket grew warm against her skin, and she found herself talking to it, to the woman in the photograph who had once faced her own impossible choices. "Tell me what to do, Mama. Tell me how to be free." But the desert answered instead, with wind that tasted of sage and ancient bones, with silence so complete it seemed to have weight. She was 3 miles from home now, then 5, then 8. Her footprints stretched behind her like a confession written in dust. The first sound of pursuit came at sunset, a distant rumble that might have been thunder if not for the cloudless sky. Hoofbeats, many of them. Her father's men, or worse, the cattle baron's hired guns. Clara looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the desert offered nothing but scattered creosote and the false promise of rocks too small to shelter behind. She ran. Her feet found thorns and stones and buried roots that tried to trip her. Her lungs burned with the dry air, and her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied now by the shouts of men who knew these lands better than she ever would. They had lanterns. They had horses. They had time and water and the law on their side. But they did not have her desperation. Clara stumbled into a shallow arroyo as full darkness fell, pressing herself against the cracked earth like a prayer. Above her, the stars began to appear, cold and distant and beautiful. She had never seen so many stars, had never realized how small the ranch made the sky seem. Out here, she could see forever. The voices passed overhead, harsh and urgent. Her father's voice, thick with rage and something that might have been fear. The cattle baron's foreman, calling her name like a curse. They would find her eventually. The desert was vast, but men like these knew how to track, how to hunt, how to bring things back that tried to run. Clara closed her eyes and touched her mother's locket. Tomorrow, she would need to find water. Tomorrow, she would need to keep moving. Tonight, she would lie in the arms of the desert and listen to its ancient song of wind and silence and freedom. The pursuit moved on, but she knew it would return. They would not give up. She was worth too much money, represented too much power. But for now, in this moment, she was exactly what she had chosen to be. She was free, and the desert would teach her what that freedom cost. 3 days without water turned her into something barely human, until a stranger found her dying beneath a Joshua tree and shared his last drop like mercy itself had taken the shape of a man. Clara's lips had cracked like dried riverbed clay by the third morning. The sun hung overhead like a malevolent eye, watching her stumble between the scattered Joshua trees that stood like twisted sentinels in the wasteland. Her jar of water had run empty yesterday, and now even her tears had dried up, leaving only salt tracks on her sunburned cheeks. The desert had taught her its first lesson. Freedom without preparation was just another word for dying. She collapsed beneath a Joshua tree, its spiky arms offering little shade, but enough to keep her from cooking completely. The silver locket around her neck had grown so hot it burned her skin, but she could not bring herself to remove it. Her mother's face, trapped behind glass, seemed to watch her with infinite sadness. "I tried, Mama," she whispered, though her voice came out as barely more than a croak. "I tried to be brave." The wind answered with silence. That was when she heard the hoofbeats. Clara's first thought was terror. Her father's men had found her at last. But the rhythm was wrong, too slow, too careful. A single rider moving without urgency. She tried to lift her head, tried to see, but the world spun like a child's top, and she fell back against the rough bark. The horse stopped nearby. Boot steps approached, measured and quiet. A shadow fell across her face, blessedly cool. "Easy now," said a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. "Easy." Clara forced her eyes open and saw him, a man carved from the desert itself. His face was weathered brown as leather, marked by years of sun and wind and hard living. His hair hung past his shoulders, black streaked with silver. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and deep and careful. He knelt beside her without haste, as if dying women were a common sight in his travels. "Water," she managed to whisper. He nodded once and reached for a canteen at his belt. His hands were large and scarred, but gentle as he lifted her head and brought the container to her lips. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever experienced. She drank greedily until he pulled it away. "Slow," he said. "Too much too fast will make you sick." His voice carried no judgment, no questions. He simply accepted her presence in the desert, as if lost women were as natural as the scattered bones of cattle that had wandered too far from water. Clara studied his face as he checked the sun's position, noting the careful way he moved, the worn Bible tucked in his saddlebags, the way his horse stood patiently without being tied. "What's your name?" she asked. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "Samuel." "I'm Clara." Another long silence. Samuel's eyes swept the horizon, always watching, always listening. When he was satisfied they were alone, he helped her sit up properly and offered her a piece of jerky from his pack. The salt and smoke flavor made her stomach clench with hunger she had forgotten she felt. "How long since you ate?" he asked. 2 days. Maybe 3. Hard to remember. Samuel nodded, as if this made perfect sense. He unpacked his gear with efficient movements, a small pot, a handful of beans, some dried corn. Soon he had a tiny fire burning and water heating, cooking a simple meal that smelled like salvation. While the beans simmered, he tended to a wounded hawk perched on a dead branch nearby. Clara watched him approach the bird with infinite patience, speaking in low, soothing tones as he checked the splint on its wing. The hawk allowed his touch, as if it understood he meant no harm. "You're far from any town," Samuel said eventually, settling back by the fire. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, running from something. It wasn't a question either. Clara touched her mother's locket and considered her options. This man could turn her in, collect whatever reward her father was surely offering. He could take advantage of her helplessness. He could simply ride away and leave her to die. Instead, he ladled beans into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Most folks out here are running from something," he said. "Desert doesn't judge. Doesn't care about your reasons. Just cares whether you're strong enough to survive what you chose." Clara ate slowly, savoring each bite. The food settled warmly in her empty stomach, and for the first time in days, she felt almost human again. Samuel ate his own portion in silence, his gray eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "South. Mexico, eventually. Running from something, too." Samuel's smile was brief and sad. "Something, or someone I used to be." The sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Samuel banked his fire and began packing his gear with the same careful efficiency. Clara watched him work, noting the way he moved like a man accustomed to solitude, the respectful distance he maintained between them. "I can't go back," she said suddenly. Samuel paused in his packing. "Don't reckon you can. Question is, where can you go?" "I don't know. I just knew I had to leave. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes you gotta trust the desert to show you the rest." He helped her stand, steadying her when the world tilted slightly. Her legs felt like water, but they held her weight. Samuel's horse, a sturdy bay gelding, waited patiently as his master secured the packs. "You can't walk much further," Samuel said. "Not in your condition." "I won't slow you down," Clara said quickly. Didn't say you would." Samuel's voice was gentle but firm. "Desert's got rules. Water and his shade belong to whoever needs them most. Right now, that's you." He helped her mount behind him, his touch careful and respectful. The horse's warmth felt good against her legs, and she found herself fighting the urge to rest her forehead against Samuel's broad back. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Clara felt something she had not experienced in months: safety. Not the false safety of her father's house, built on walls and locks and fear. This was different. This was the safety that came from being with someone who understood the desert's rules and lived by them without complaint. The stars emerged overhead as they traveled, more brilliant than Clara had ever seen them. Samuel knew where he was going, following paths invisible to her eyes. His horse moved with sure-footed confidence through the darkness. "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked softly. Samuel was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regret. Maybe because someone should have helped her. Clara didn't ask who she was. Some stories she was learning belonged to the desert silence. But as they rode through the starlit wasteland, she began to understand that rescue sometimes came in unexpected forms, and that freedom, real freedom, might require more than just running away. He told her he used to be the kind of man who collected debts in blood, but when 5 bounty hunters rode into their camp with guns drawn, Samuel had to choose between his peaceful redemption and the woman he'd sworn to protect. The bounty hunters came at dawn, their spurs singing death songs against the rocky ground. Clara woke to Samuel's hand covering her mouth, his gray eyes urgent in the pale light. 5 men set their horses at the edge of their small camp. arranged like vultures who had caught the scent of carrion. Clara Whitmore, called the leader, a thin man with cold eyes and a badge that caught the morning sun. Your daddy's real worried about you, girl. Sent us to bring you home safe. Samuel's jaw tightened. He rose slowly, his hands visible and empty, but Clara could see the coiled tension in his shoulders. The weighted silence of a man calculating odds he didn't like. You boys are a long way from anywhere, Samuel said, his voice carrying the easy drawl of someone making friendly conversation. I want to water your horses before you head back. The leader's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Oh, we ain't leaving without the girl. See, there's $1,000 bounty on her safe return, and another 1,000 for the man who's been harboring her. His eyes fixed on Samuel with predatory interest. Dead or alive, the poster says. Don't much matter to us. Clara's blood turned to ice water. $1,000 was more money than most men saw in 5 years. It was enough to make killers out of honest men, enough to make betrayal feel like common sense. But Samuel didn't move toward her, didn't consider the money for even a heartbeat. Girl's free to go where she pleases, he said quietly. This is still America, last I checked. Not for runaway daughters, it ain't. The leader spat tobacco juice into the dust, and especially not for the men fool enough to steal them. That was when Samuel's careful mask slipped, just for an instant. Clara saw something flicker in his gray eyes, something dark and terrible that belonged to the man he used to be. I never stole nothing from nobody, Samuel said, and his voice had gone soft in a way that made the horses shift nervously. But I reckon you boys don't care much about the truth. Truth? The leader laughed again. Truth is, you're outnumbered 5-1. Truth is, we got iron and you got empty hands. Truth is, this ends one way or the other, and we're riding home with that girl. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from man to man, reading them like a book written in gun leather and bad intentions. Clara held her breath, waiting for him to step aside, to let them take her. It would be the smart thing, the safe thing. Instead, Samuel smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Boys, he said conversationally, you made one mistake coming here. Yeah? What's that? You assumed I was the same man I was yesterday. The leader's hand dropped toward his gun, but Samuel was already moving. Clara had never seen a man draw so fast, had never imagined it was possible. The Colt appeared in Samuel's hand like magic, speaking thunder and flame before the bounty hunter's pistol had cleared leather. The leader pitched backward from his saddle, blood blooming across his chest like a dark flower. His horse reared, screaming, as gunfire erupted from every direction. Samuel grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead, chipping stone and raising clouds of dust. He pressed his rifle into her hands, his face grim but oddly peaceful. Know how to load this? Clara nodded, though her hands shook like autumn leaves. Samuel gave her a leather pouch full of cartridges and positioned himself at the edge of their makeshift cover. Keep feeding me bullets, he said, and whatever happens, stay low. The gunfight was brief but brutal. Samuel moved like a man born to violence, each shot deliberate and final. Clara loaded the rifle with mechanical precision, her fear transformed into something colder and more useful. She had never killed a man, but watching these hunters try to drag her back to a life of slavery, she found herself hoping Samuel's aim stayed true. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead in the dust. The remaining 2 were spurring their horses toward the horizon, shouting promises of return and reinforcement. Samuel watched them go without pursuing, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. They'll be back, Clara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. With more men. And word of where we are. Samuel began gathering their supplies with quick efficiency. Your father will know by sunset. The cattle barren too. Clara felt the weight of that knowledge settle on her shoulders like a funeral shroud. There would be no more running, no more hiding in the desert's embrace. The entire territory would be hunting them now. I'm sorry, she whispered. I've ruined everything. Your peaceful life, your... Samuel stopped packing and turned to face her fully. His gray eyes held no anger, no regret, only a strange kind of gratitude. "Clara," he said gently, "I ain't had a peaceful life since I was younger than you are now. Been carrying the weight of what I'd done for 20 years, trying to find some way to balance the scales." He gestured toward the dead man. "Maybe this is it. Maybe protecting something good is worth more than pretending I was never bad." He helped her mount his horse, and they rode hard toward the deeper desert, following trails that existed only in Samuel's memory. Behind them, the vultures were already circling, drawn by the smell of blood and the promise of easy meat. Clara pressed her face against Samuel's back as they rode, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his shirt. He had killed for her, had thrown away his chance at redemption for a girl he barely knew. The weight of that sacrifice was almost too much to bear. "Where will we go?" she asked. "South. Always south, past the reach of your father's money and that cattle baron's influence." And then Samuel was quiet for a long time, the horse's hooves marking steady time against the desert floor. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something Clara had never heard before: hope. "Then we see what kind of life two broken people can build together." The sun climbed higher, and the desert stretched endlessly ahead, no longer a place to die, but a place to be reborn. But behind them, dust clouds were already rising, carrying the thunder of many horses and the weight of unfinished business. When her father and the cattle baron finally cornered them at a hidden desert spring, Clara had to choose between the golden cage of wealth and a love that bloomed wild in the harshest ground, and her choice would cost someone everything. The hidden spring lay cupped in the desert's palm like a secret whispered between stones. Samuel had led them to this place following paths known only to the Apache and the desperately lost, a sanctuary where beryl cactus bloomed yellow against impossible odds and water bubbled up from depths that remembered when this land was young. They had traveled for 3 days without speaking much, communicating instead through shared glances and the comfortable rhythm of two people learning to move as one. Samuel taught Clara to read the desert's subtle signs, how morning dew collected in the hollow of certain leaves, which cacti bore fruit that could sustain life, how the stars mapped routes toward freedom or death. At night, beside their small fires, they shared the deeper truths that daylight made too painful to speak. Clara told him about her mother's slow death, how her father had locked himself away in grief and emerged as someone else entirely, a man who saw his daughter not as a person, but as property to be protected, controlled, and eventually sold. Samuel spoke of the weight of 20 years' worth of violence, how he had collected debts in blood and broken spirits for gold, until the morning he woke up and could no longer recognize the man in the mirror. "I killed a boy once," he said on their second night, staring into the flames. "Couldn't have been more than 16. He was stealing cattle, and his daddy couldn't pay what was owed." Samuel's hands shook as he poured coffee from the dinner pot. "I told myself it was justice. Told myself a lot of lies in those days." Clara reached across the fire and covered his scarred hands with her own. "That wasn't you. That was who you had to be to survive. Was it? Or was that who I chose to be because it was easier than being good?" She had no answer for that, but her touch seemed to steady him anyway. In the morning, he taught her to shoot his rifle, steadying her aim with patient hands while she learned to find her target through the iron sights. Now, beside the hidden spring, Clara knelt to fill their water containers while Samuel tended to his horse and the wounded hawk he still carried. The bird was nearly healed, its wings strong enough for short flights, but it seemed reluctant to leave their small company. "Even wild things sometimes choose companionship over freedom," Samuel observed, offering the hawk a piece of jerky. Clara smiled at that. "Maybe it knows something we don't." The piece shattered like glass when her father's voice carried across the desert air. "Clara, I know you're there, daughter. Come out and end this foolishness." They came from 3 directions: her father from the east with his ranch hands, the cattle baron from the south with his hired guns, and a group of territorial marshals from the west. 12 men in total, armed and angry and patient as death itself. Samuel's hand dropped to his gun, but Clara stopped him with a touch. "No more killing," she said quietly. "Not for me. Clara," her father's voice cracked like a whip. "You will come home this instant. You will marry Theodore Blackwood as agreed, or I'll see this outlaw hang from the nearest tree." The cattle baron himself emerged from behind a cluster of rocks. Theodore Blackwood, thick-bodied and cold-eyed, wearing his wealth-like armor. His voice carried the smooth arrogance of a man accustomed to owning everything he desired. "The girl is legally bound to me by contract," he called. "Her father accepted my proposal and my gold. She's already mine by law." Clara stood slowly, her hand still resting on Samuel's arm. The spring bubbled peacefully behind them, indifferent to the human drama unfolding on its banks. "I am not property," she said, her voice carrying across the desert with surprising strength. "I am not cattle to be bought and sold. I am not a contract to be honored." Her father's face flushed red with rage and embarrassment. "You are my daughter. You will obey me. You stopped being my father the day you sold me." Clara's voice remained steady, though tears ran down her cheeks. "Mama died believing I would choose my own path. I won't dishonor her memory by becoming a slave to your debts." Theodore Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "Pretty words, girl. But words don't change the law. You're coming with me whether you like it or not." That was when Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and the assembled guns. His movements were deliberate and calm, but Clara could see the coiled violence in his shoulders. "The lady has made her choice," he said simply. "Seems to me that ought to be the end of it." "You filled her head with romantic nonsense," her father snarled. "Clara, this man is a killer, a criminal. He'll abandon you the moment you become inconvenient." Clara looked at Samuel, really looked at him. She saw the gray eyes that had watched over her sleep, the gentle hands that had tended wounded animals, the patient way he had taught her to survive in the wasteland. She saw the man who had killed for her protection and would probably die for her freedom. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but that would still be my choice to make." Her father's expression crumbled. For a moment, she saw past his anger to the grief and fear beneath. A man who had lost his wife and could not bear to lose his daughter too, even if holding on her meant destroying who she was. "Clara, please," he whispered, "come home. We'll find another way, another arrangement." The desert wind stirred the yellow blooms of the barrel cactus, carrying with it the scent of sage and freedom and endless possibility. Clara closed her eyes and felt her mother's presence in that wind, felt her approval in the warmth of the hidden spring. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer her father's daughter or Theodore Blackwood's property. She was simply Clara, standing in a place where impossible flowers bloomed. "My home is wherever I choose to make it," she said, "and I choose to make it with him." The silence stretched tight as a hangman's rope. Then Theodore Blackwood reached for his gun, and everything happened at once. Samuel moved like lightning, his Colt clearing leather as Clara threw herself sideways toward the spring. Gunfire erupted from every direction, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The wounded hawk launched itself into the air with a cry that sounded almost human. When the smoke cleared, Theodore Blackwood lay face down in the dust, his blood mixing with the desert sand. Two of his hired guns were down as well, while Samuel knelt behind a boulder, clutching his left shoulder where blood seeped between his fingers. But her father stood untouched, his gun still holstered, his face gray with the weight of what he had witnessed. "Go," he said quietly. "Take your horse and go. I'll tell them you both died in the gunfight." Clara stared at him. "Daddy, your mother would never forgive me if I brought you back in chains." His voice broke on the words. "I'd rather have a daughter who chose her own life than no daughter at all." Clara ran to him then, throwing her arms around the man who had raised her, who had tried to protect her in the only way he knew how. They held each other as the sun climbed higher and the desert wind sang its ancient song of loss and love and letting go. "Be happy, Clara," he whispered. "Be free." She helped Samuel onto his horse, binding his wound with strips torn from her shirt. As they rode away from the spring, she looked back once to see her father standing alone among the desert flowers, a small figure against the vastness of the sky. The hidden spring faded behind them as they followed the ancient trails toward Mexico, toward a future written by their own hands. Samuel's blood had stopped flowing, and his breathing was steady. He would live. They would live. And somewhere in the desert behind them, yellow flowers bloomed in defiance of the burning sun, proving that love could take root in the most unlikely places.